And I don't know why I'm still on here. And then Mandy, I think you're going to have to also let everybody in.
Sure, that's fine.
All right. I think we're, looks like we've got a number of folks that are logged on. So trying to keep this on time to provide Mandy maximum amount of time for her wonderful presentation. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this month's Lunch and Learn session hosted by the Love for Lawrence Foundation. We have the pleasure of welcoming Mandy O'Malley from Resilient Retreat to our Lunch and Learn series today. And Mandy will be speaking on something that sadly a lot of us know. We know what it is, we've experienced it ourselves, and unfortunately more and more every day, given the last couple of years. But it's compassion fatigue. So Mandy will get into a very interesting conversation there. But first I'll introduce her as she is proud to serve as the community wellness educator for Resilient Retreat, which is an organization whose mission means a great deal to her, both personally and professionally. Mandy brings to this position over 20 years of experience working in the nonprofit sector, including 18 years in child protective services, where she experienced burnout herself among her colleagues. She has a passion for making the world a better place, one conversation at a time. And I can tell you that, Mandy, that resonates significantly with the Love for Lawrence mission. You're looking to change the conversation and destigmatize, especially depression and suicide, really one conversation at a time. So without further ado, I'll introduce Mandy, and she'll introduce her organization, the Resilient Retreat, and walk us through her presentation on compassion fatigue. So thank you so much, Mandy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today. And I really do think that's why we are so glad to connect with Love for Lawrence, is that idea of starting difficult conversations and destigmatizing the experiences that we all share, not only as community members, but people who are working really hard to make the world a little bit better. And sometimes that has an impact, not sometimes, always that has an impact, but sometimes we choose not to deal with it head on. So I'm so glad today to have the chance to talk to you and really start this conversation. And that's what we hope, is that it's really just a start of a conversation. We're going to do a whirlwind tour today of compassion fatigue and resilience building and burnout. And we're going to go fast through a lot of material because this is a really important conversation and I want to make the most of the opportunity that we have. but I know that we're going to have the chance to put some questions in the chat box, and I'm going to answer those at the end, but also I'm going to invite you to continue this conversation with me. You'll have my contact information with your colleagues to promote the work that we do at Resilient Retreat as a resource. I was raised in a family where we talked about, if you bring up a problem, we need to brainstorm a solution. So I'm going to come to you to talk about the issue of compassion fatigue and burnout, but I'm also going to give you what I hope are some tips, some context, some ways to reframe things that you're already doing or to think about things that you might want to start doing, and then an ongoing support network that is Resilient Retreat. If you haven't heard of us yet, we are very lucky to have support of a lot of organizations like Love for Lawrence, but we're new. So we're always looking at ways to increase our visibility so that we can meet the need of our community. We provide innovative, research-backed approaches to assist those impacted by trauma. We are not crisis interventionists, we are support after a crisis so people can go from surviving to thriving. And we do that by providing interdisciplinary programs that address the impact of trauma on our minds, on our bodies, and our spirits. And we do that in programs, everything from equine therapy, which we recently had a cohort, thanks to the support of Love for Lawrence, who had tremendous positive results from their experience with equine therapy, to neurofeedback, to skill building workshops, to peer support groups. And we are building a retreat center on an 84-acre parcel of nature land in Sarasota, where we'll be able to house retreats for 3 days. So people can come and learn all of the different tools and take home the ones that work for them, that help them really embrace that ability to thrive. We work with survivors of interpersonal trauma, and we work with helping professionals and first responders who struggle with secondary exposure to stress and trauma from their work. In addition to those primary programs, we also do professional training for organizations. So things like today, I've been working with the police department, I've been working with the sheriff's office, with the hospital, with the school districts on compassion fatigue, wellness, resilience, burnout, and all the things that we're going to explore today. But as Ian said in his introduction, my first goal for today is really destigmatizing this experience. As he mentioned, I spent 18 years in the child abuse response system. I did in the trenches forensic interviewing, I did intervention, I did prevention, I did training, I did parenting, all around the very toxic world of child abuse prevention. And at that time, more than 20 years ago, no one was talking about the idea of compassion fatigue. And when I experienced burnout, and when many of my colleagues experienced burnout, our work suffered, and therefore the community suffered because we were not at our best to care for kids. And many of my incredibly talented colleagues left the work because they thought, maybe I'm just not cut out for it. But the reality is, asking someone to work caring for people, whether it's child welfare, whether it's mental health, whether it's medical care, whether it's human services, whether it's education, asking people to do that work, there's a natural outgrowth of compassion fatigue that we need to identify and build proactive systems, and we need to have people be able to rehabilitate from that so we keep talent in those important fields of work. It would be like me asking you to walk through water without getting wet. The idea of doing this difficult work and it not impacting us would be that ridiculous. So my first goal for today is just starting this conversation and saying, compassion fatigue is natural. It's an understandable reaction. We have to embrace that so that we can prevent it. When I use the phrase compassion fatigue, it was really coined as the cost of caring by Dr. Charles Figley in the early 80s when he was doing research work at Florida State University. And he identified compassion fatigue as really having two significant components: burnout and secondary traumatic stress. Burnout affects all employees. We've all seen over the past couple of years with service providers being understaffed, that when we go somewhere like a retail establishment or a restaurant, there are burned out employees. Because burnout really is when we are exhausted by the demand of our job exceeding our resources. Compassion fatigue is when we couple that for helping professionals with their exposure to secondary traumatic stress. So they are helping clients, families, people in the community with their services who are under stress, and vicariously they feel the effects of that stress. Compassion fatigue not only impacts the individual with physical and mental health components, but it also impacts job performance and organizational health. So it's important that we start to have these conversations to normalize the discussion, to identify the factors at work, and then be able to work with our staff who is making the community a better place so that they can be at their best. As I mentioned, burnout is really that exhaustion. There's 3 key hallmarks of burnout. We start to get depersonalized. We distance ourselves. I know when I was working in child welfare, I used to have a couple of guideposts for myself. When the work incapacitated me and I was no longer functioning because it was so upsetting to me, but also when I no longer was impacted by the work, I needed to figure something out. Because working in child welfare should bother us, what we see every day. But when we get burned out, we start to depersonalize from that. We also become very cynical. That's one of the hallmarks of burnout. We have a reduced sense of mission accomplishment. And the trick there is, as a helping professional, if we can't provide services that help, our mission is really the core of what we do. We're not able to be satisfied with our job. And then the third hallmark sign is, and we've probably all had colleagues who have experienced this, we lose our ability to modulate reactions. So a little thing becomes a great big deal, or a big deal, we suddenly are apathetic towards, like, nah, we're cynical. What difference does it make anyway? So those are 3 things we see in someone that's burned out across professions. Those not only have those hallmark symptoms, but they can cause changes in eating, sleeping patterns, physical illnesses, especially somatic illnesses like stomach aches and headaches. We feel very isolated. We have trouble getting our work done. We start blowing off our work assignments or missing deadlines. You can see how that not only impacts the individual, but it impacts the team that they're working with. And then we couple that with secondary traumatic stress. When the people that we're working with are under stress or have experienced trauma, they bring that to their work with us, and we experience it vicariously. Interestingly, we as helpers without a primary experience of trauma can actually develop symptoms that exactly mirror post-traumatic stress disorder in a primary survivor. So someone experiences trauma and they have an acute onset of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. Or I'm working with people over time, my ability to cope slowly deteriorates and I slowly develop those same symptoms. But the mental health and physical health consequences are exactly the same. And we know that this happens, and we need to put it in a biological perspective that there should have no shame attached to. Mirror neurons really are being seen as potentially the seat of our ability to have empathy. When developing brain scans of monkeys, mirror neurons were a collateral discovery that have become incredibly important, and we have them in our brains and throughout our gut system. And they were discovered because when this researcher was scanning the monkey eating a peanut, certain neurons fired. When that monkey was watching another monkey eat a peanut, those exact same neurons fired, leading to research with discovery of mirror neurons. The reason why it's really important that we understand that phenomenon is it takes this out, compassion fatigue, out of a discussion of strength or weakness and puts it as a biological component that we can expect to be a natural outgrowth of our work. We all see mirror neurons at work all of the time. Have you ever been in a meeting in the conference room and someone pushes back, crosses their arms, and adopts really closed body language? And within just a few minutes, if you look around the room, subconsciously, people are beginning to mirror that body language. Or someone walks down the hall in front of your office and they stub their toe and your gut falls to your knees. That's your mirror neurons firing, identifying with that same experience. We're those monkeys watching another monkey. The reason it's important is not only for that stigma reduction, but also that we understand the vehicles that allow us to be good at community work with other people, whether it's in mental health, medical health, human services, or any other way that we interact helping people every day. The very things that make us good, our connection, our empathy, are also the vehicle for that secondary traumatic stress. So it's a neurological reaction that we have to learn to moderate. When we don't, we see individual impacts, physical health, emotional health, discord in relationships, dissatisfaction with our job. And as leaders in organizations, we start to see higher staff turnover, decreased quality of care. We have a lot of expenses around occupational stress. We have negative environments for other employees, and we've all seen feelings are contagious. So we have a burned out employee dealing with compassion fatigue that begins to infiltrate our team. So what do we do? If we know this is a natural part of working with people, what do we do? Well, there's some cultural practices, organizational practices, shifting to compassion fatigue, reducing the stigma like we've talked about several times, and prioritizing being able to talk about these issues so that we can build systems of practice that protect the people that do the work in our community. There's three main things on an individual basis that we can do. And we can have lots of discussions about the organizational and leadership components, because it can't just be one thing gets thrown at the employee level and compassion fatigue goes away. We really have to talk about cultural shifts. But there's only so much that we can control today at a Lunch and Learn. So let's talk about three things that we know make a big difference when you're coping with compassion fatigue, or when you're trying to prevent it from being something that you're coping with. Sharing a narrative is just telling the story of your experience. Perceptual maturation is changing the way we define success and some behaviors that nurture resilience. Sharing the narrative, venting, talking things through, processing, all the ways that we talk about it are really important that we engage in the conversation that tells the story of our experience. It's important for two different reasons. One, when we tell that story, we put ourselves in more of a power position within that experience. And that sounds like a very slight semantic argument, but it's really impactful for our mental health. One of the key indicators for how impactful in a negative way a trauma experience is the level of powerlessness that the person who is experiencing the trauma feels at the time of that experience. When we tell the story of the experience, we now shift to the first person. In our brain, that little psychological shift reduces the powerlessness that we feel, reducing the impact of that trauma. So when we talk to a loved one, a colleague, or write in a journal the story of our experience with that traumatic incident at work or the stress that we're feeling, we make that shift. The other thing that it does is it bookends that experience and it allows our brain to file it as a memory. When we file that experience as a memory, it reduces the chance of what's known as intrusive thoughts. That happens with post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues that relate to post-traumatic stress disorder. So those experiences where you're sitting at the dinner table trying to have dinner with your loved ones and you keep thinking about the client at work, that's an intrusive thought. Intrusive thoughts are less likely to occur when we've been able to fully process that experience and file it in our mental banks as a memory. So when we tell the story, we encapsulate it and we file it away. That's another protective factor that we have to protect us from those intrusive thoughts. Even more important, while we're putting our experience to words, is to make sure that we're breathing, not holding our breath, we're relaxing our body, and we're in the present moment. Helping us be in the present moment is awareness of our senses and our surroundings. So those are some easy things. If you look at Bessel van der Kolk or Dr. Eric Gentry or Dr. Peter Levine's work, they talk about the somatic experience, the body experience, where we hold our trauma and our stress. When we can relax our body, telling the story of our experience and filing it away, we actually reduce the impact of that stress and trauma. Not only as the person telling the story, but if you have a colleague or loved one, encouraging them and then actively listening to them telling the story has a dramatic impact on their ability to avoid compassion fatigue. When I was working in child welfare, I spent 8 years as a forensic interviewer. And what that really means is children who were victimized came to my office and I did videotaped interviews with them that were utilized as court evidence. And when I was new in my career, I defined success as prosecution and perhaps even conviction. Because if I did my interview well, the person that did something wrong would have consequences for that and the child would be protected. But what happened was I was defining success by things I had no control over. So I was setting myself up for frustration all of the time. By learning to shift my definition of success to the things I could control. Now, was I pleased when the process worked? Absolutely, all the way to fruition. But by shifting my perspective and my perception of success, I was in control of those things. I was no longer a victim of that system. Remember how we just talked about trauma increases when we have no control? So shift perspectives and relinquishing outcomes that are beyond our control. Constantly being aware and perceiving our own level so we know where we are on this spectrum and really grasping our mission and values. And we're going to talk about that. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about self-care. And if you're like me, you hear that phrase and once in a while, it just rubs you wrong because you think self-care, is this just permission to be indulgent? I can do whatever I want in the name of self-care because it's kind of become the buzzword. What we're talking about are the intentional habits that lead you towards your goal, leads you to success as you define it. Now, if you want to be indulgent, bubble baths, chocolate, whatever it is, go for it. But don't only think of self-care as that. We have to break the habit we have in our culture of priding ourselves on exhaustion and productivity being our worth. We have to kind of buck the system that says we shouldn't take time to take care of ourselves. We have to break out of our habits, and helping professionals are really, really bad at this. We all are. And that's why it's important that we remember to have these conversations and we give permission to ourselves and each other to take care of ourselves so we can do our work. I love this quote. If you don't want to burn out, you have to stop living like you're on fire. So we have to figure out, okay, what do we do about this? If you get on an airplane, and we haven't been flying as much lately, maybe the last couple years, but if you get on an airplane, the airline steward valiantly tries to remind us all of emergency procedures. And one of them is they remind us if the oxygen mask deploys, put your own oxygen mask on first before you try to help other people. And if you're like me, when you're flying, you're usually with loved ones, and that seems really counterintuitive. You're like, hang on, I've got my kids with me, my parents with me, my spouse with me. How can I put my own oxygen mask on first? But we have to remember, if we don't do that, then we cannot help anyone else. So those who depend on us to help them professionally and personally need us to put our oxygen mask on first. So I want you to have that visual when you're going to work or you're coming home from work, you're putting your oxygen mask on. We're going to skip and I'm going to let you share at the end what might work for you and talk about the things in self-care that the science really shows take care of us. Self-regulating activities. Just like our mirror neurons are a biological response, so is our need to self-regulate. Self-regulation really just means making sure we can control and command our emotions and our biology as much as possible. We need to keep our nervous system in rest and digest mode instead of fight or flight mode. When we perceive threat, our amygdala charges to the forefront and starts sending out hormones and neurotransmitters signaling hypervigilance and fear. It's a biological response. And so we have to learn how to regulate our reactions to that perception of threat. Because when we don't, we hold that in our system and then it's having that long-term impact. So things like scanning our body. Remember how Eric Gentry, I mentioned, says relaxation is the key to eliminating the long-term impact of stress and trauma. So if we can scan our body and notice, oh, by the end of the day, my shoulder's up around my ear, let me work that out so I'm not holding those neurotransmitters in that musculature to be released later. When I'm clenching my jaw, and so I'm going to pay attention every little bit to scanning. Or before I go to bed at night, I'm going to do conscious relaxation from the top of my head to the bottom of my feet and go through it one little bit at a time to make sure I'm relaxing those muscles. It's doing things like yoga, where we're stretching our bodies and combining it with breathing. I love telling people about intentional breathing because for many of us, it's hard to engage in a long practice. But intentional breathing is super easy. We can do it anytime, any place, no equipment needed, and nobody even needs to know you're doing it. If I were to ask everyone on this call to put a hand on their chest and a hand down on their diaphragm and feel where you're breathing, for most of us, we breathe very shallowly, especially when we're under stress. Why does that matter? Well, two different things. One, we're shortchanging our oxygen needs. So if we can take some big, deep breaths, we actually get a full exchange of oxygen. That helps us signal our brain to reduce that level of stress. The other thing is diaphragmatic breathing actually stimulates our vagus nerve, which then tells our nervous system it's okay to be in rest and digest mode. So just taking 3 or 4 big, deep diaphragmatic breaths at every stoplight or once an hour, you stand up from your desk and you take some big breaths will help reduce the impact of burnout and compassion fatigue. You can also engage in a more formal practice. The US Navy SEALs teach every single recruit something called box breathing, where you simply inhale through your nose for a count of 4, hold it for a count of 4, exhale to a count of 4, and hold your lungs empty for a count of 4. And in just a few cycles, blood pressure is lower, heart rate's lower. When blood pressure and heart rate's lower, we go back into that rest and digest mode with the proper part of our nervous system in control. So those self-regulating activities we need to make time and energy for. Taking time for ourselves, getting away and changing scenery, expressing ourselves, that narrative that we talked about. Maybe the narrative for you is writing in a journal and you don't have to do it perfectly with proper syntax and grammar, just get the words out. Or it may be through a creative expression. Remembering we're looking for balance and well-being as a goal instead of perfection, nurturing mindfulness. Many of my colleagues love meditation and there is decades of research on the effectiveness of meditation. I would encourage you to look into that, utilize apps for it, but you can also benefit from just mindfulness, which is really about aligning our thoughts in time and space with the present tense. Because often we're anxious and nervous and feeling stressed, ruminating about something that has happened or worrying about something that will happen. So when we align that in space, and there's 2 ways to really force our brain back into the present time. One is through sensory input. So a grounding exercise, something like an exercise known as 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, where we think to ourselves 5 things in the environment right now that I can see for visual input. 4 things that I can feel. And now this isn't emotions, this is physical sensations, things like the floor under my feet or my shirt on my shoulder. 3 things in my environment right now that I can hear, 2 things I can smell, and 1 thing I can taste. By doing that, we're forcing our brain to focus on sensory input, which pushes us back into the present moment. The other way that we can do that is by engaging higher order thinking. Something as simple as naming every NFL team or every breed of dog, or counting backwards by 13, or saying the alphabet in reverse, forces our brain to reduce that amygdala back to its proper position and our higher order thinking to come forward. So mindfulness is really important. And then having routines and predictability. Athletes rely on muscle memory, where they practice a physical task to where they can do it without conscious thought. Routines and predictability do the same kind of work for us with mental muscle memory. So we don't have to be hyper vigilant about what's coming. We know we have a routine, we can predict things. Sometimes we avoid that because we don't want to be boring. But when we're feeling particularly stressed, it's important to embrace routines and predictability so that we can know what's coming and we don't have to be hypervigilant. Some of us are born more optimistic than others. Our temperament is more happy and outgoing and easy. But all of us can actively nurture that. It's another muscle that we can use. We have to cultivate that positive outlook. Dr. Martin Seligman is the known founder of a branch of psychology called positive psychology, that instead of looking at brokenness and healing, looks at building on strengths. And he and the school of thought of positive psychology really talk about flexing that muscle, celebrating the wins, no matter how small, how individual, or using them vicariously. If our team wins, I win vicariously. And one of the exercises that Seligman and his colleagues have advocated for is just simply called journaling 3 good things a day. What that exercise entails is every night sitting down and jotting notes on 3 things that went well during the day, why they went well, and how it made you feel. What Seligman and his researchers found is after just 7 days of doing that activity consistently, their research subjects rated higher on factors of happiness and contentment up to 6 months later from just 7 days, 5 minutes a night. Now, the mechanism for that is really simple. We just don't think about it. I bought a black Honda Pilot a couple years ago. And as soon as I drove it off the lot, I started seeing black Honda Pilots everywhere. It wasn't that suddenly there was a big rush on black Honda Pilots. They just hadn't been relevant to me before that day. And when I started looking for them, I saw more of them. Well, Seligman's colleagues are hypothesizing, and actually the research is backing up, the exact same mechanism. When we look for those positives, we start to see more of them. The more that we see, we get better at being optimistic. And it has an impact on our contentment, our satisfaction, and our rates of happiness. It's a really great return on investment. And it helps us remember our why. So it's doing those things that actively nurture optimism. When we, as helping professionals, are asked to engage in self-care, it's often difficult, but we're really good at supporting other people. So I want to give you 4 really simple tools that you can use to offer support to colleagues. There's that old adage about all boats rise with the tide. So if we're all helping support each other, we're all going to benefit from that. So validation, education, empowerment, and support. Validation is simply remembering to acknowledge how someone feels and meeting them where they are. And validating their feelings doesn't mean we agree with them, that we would feel the same way, or even that we necessarily think they should feel that way. But it's acknowledging where they feel, how they feel, and where they are. Just like we're hardwired to survive, as human beings, we also need to be seen, heard, and understood. Validation is giving people that need so that it's met. I recognize where you are. I understand your feelings. Education is a really important tool. We want to guide people to resources and give advice, but often we jump to it too quickly. So what we want is to make sure that when someone is sharing their narrative, we give them the space to do that in a supportive environment. I have a spouse who doesn't like to see me upset. And so when I come home and I'm venting, I usually have already planned what I'm going to do about whatever the situation is. But he jumps in and says, well, why don't you, or have you thought of? And then it kind of cuts me off at the knees. Whereas if he could let me tell the whole story, then offer the advice. So as colleagues, as providers of care, we just have to remember to offer that in a way that allows people to share their narrative and supports them, but then also gives them that opportunity when it's invited. Empowerment is an incredibly part of being trauma informed. It's very important that we give people the opportunity to self-determine. Again, going back to the impact of trauma highly is affected by the amount of powerlessness that we feel. So when we have the ability to make choices, to express ourselves, to have a voice in a conversation, not only do we build on strengths and we learn to see those strengths, but we also avoid power struggles where we don't need to have them. And then support skills, reflective listening. Again, that validation. I hear you. I'm going to reflect back what I've heard you say so you know that I understand. Allowing for silence with someone, especially in a psychologically, emotionally, physically safe space. We've all been in a hallway where someone says, hey, that was a rough day yesterday. How you doing? As they keep right on walking. The message is, I'm going to ask, but I don't really want you to talk to me about it. So we need to make sure that we're providing opportunities for safe space where it's conducive to actually provide support. And then remember back to the beginning of our conversation where we're talking about mirror neurons. They're pesky in that they can help transmit compassion fatigue, but they also can transmit calm and messages of self-regulation. When I am in a meeting and I cross my arms, someone else will most likely adopt that same posture. But if I'm meeting with a colleague in stress and experiencing difficulty, and I'm breathing deeply and my body is relaxed, those mirror neurons for them also pick that up and begin to help them breathe intentionally and relax their body. And breathing intentionally and relaxing our body dramatically mitigates the impact of that stress. So we don't have to have the answers. We don't have to give a solution. We just have to reflect back that we understand, and we have to model self-regulation for someone else. So when we can practice those things, we are ready for when our colleagues or our loved ones need us to provide that support. Then we want to shift to compassion satisfaction. Just like compassion fatigue is the phenomenon where we're worn away by the work that we do, compassion satisfaction is actually what builds us back up. It's those things that bring us fulfillment, why we chose to do the work that we do, acknowledging the difference that we make. We often look at the end of our day at the things still on our to-do list and don't pay any attention to the things that we've done during the day. It's shifting that perspective to say, I wasn't able to help everyone. I wasn't able to stop every bad thing from happening, but I was able to do this, and focusing on that. Often we give credit to our colleagues for strengths that we also have, and it's recognizing that we have them. And again, actively cultivating that sense of purpose and meaning that we bring to our job every day. Brené Brown so eloquently said, in the midst of a struggle, we don't need shame for being human. When I've been learning more and more about compassion fatigue, it was helpful for me to recognize that Mother Teresa, kind of one of those people that we almost romanticize as a servant leader, used to have orders for not only herself, but her fellow sisters doing the difficult work that they were doing, that for every 3 years they were in the field, they actually withdrew for a year to rehabilitate and to refill their cup. If Mother Teresa required that, I think we should give ourselves the understanding that the work caring for others is taxing, and we have to give ourselves and each other grace. Sometimes, just like we're better at taking care of other people than ourselves, it's good to take that perspective shift and say, what kind of example do I want to set for my loved ones? Do I want them to engage in self-care? Do I want them to prioritize balance? Or do I want them wearing themselves out to exhaustion? And then there's a lot of adages about pouring from an empty cup or a well being dry. The poet Rumi actually says we shouldn't give from the well, we should give from the overflow. So it's remembering those things and giving ourselves that grace. I'm going to open it for questions, trying to give us plenty of time for some interactive conversations around your experiences, the things that have challenged you, the things that are working well for you. But I also want to make sure that this slide stays up for a minute while we talk, because I want you to know that this is just the beginning of this conversation. The services that I described at the beginning of our conversation are free of charge for individuals. We do our training on a sliding fee scale, but all of those programs and retreats that I mentioned have no cost to individuals. Not only today do I want you to take with you the content and hopefully a new way of thinking and embracing of context for our conversation, but I want you to take that resource for you, for colleagues, for loved ones who have either experienced trauma personally and or experienced trauma in their workplace. Go to our website, see our programs, know that they're confidential, they're research-based, and they're free of charge. Email me, call our colleagues and see how we can work together. Let's continue the conversation around resilience building and recognizing that compassion fatigue is real, it's expected, it's okay, you can rebound from it. It's just a natural reaction to difficult work, but it doesn't mean that you're not doing the job exactly the way that you're supposed to be doing it. So let's open for questions, Ian, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely. And Mandy, I think I speak for everyone and say, holy smokes, what a wonderful presentation. So you do have a question on asking about organizational responsibility for removing or changing practices and structures that knowingly contribute to compassion fatigue. What are yours and the Resilient Retreats thoughts on that responsibility at the organizational level?
I think that it is real, and it's very important to have that part of the conversation. I think when we've started embracing self-care, a lot of times what happens in reality is organizations say, well, let's just throw a yoga class in the break room once a month and that'll take care of it. And is that beneficial? Yeah. Is that going to solve the issue? No. This is a top-down and a bottom-up approach. There are things that individually we can do. And today we talked about individual responsibilities and options. But organizations certainly have a responsibility to take the lead on sharing this information and embracing a culture of health and wellness. That is things like recognizing just because your employee has a cell phone doesn't mean that Sunday morning at 6 a.m. is an appropriate time for a client call. It means encouraging people to actually take their leave time. It means having systems where you can be honest about how you're feeling about your work. I recently spent 21 days at one of the local law enforcement agencies working with all of the sworn law enforcement officers. And at that time, we confronted, there is still a stigma. If I say that this trauma, and an average, just to put it in context, an average law enforcement officer responds in a course of a career to 900 traumatic episodes. So certainly they're exposed to trauma. I heard over and over, but my fitness for duty will be called into question if I start talking about this stuff. Well, what happens is we internalize it and we have collateral damage. Substance abuse and trauma correlate. Homelessness, trauma correlate. Suicidal ideation and trauma correlate when it's not being processed and adequately supported. So absolutely. And you need to get creative, I think, as organizations. At Resilient Retreat, one of the things that we do, which is phenomenal, is we have what we call collective disconnect days, because we encourage people on staff to take time away. But what happens when I'm away from my desk and I know everyone else is at work? I feel guilty that I've left my colleagues to pick up the slack for that day. I'm still checking out my emails. So we actually have adopted days when the entire office closes so that everyone can stop, disconnect at the same time. So there are a lot of things we can do. In fact, we do whole trainings on leadership and cultural adaptations that organizations can do. So if someone's interested in talking more about that, please let me know. Any other questions?
Well, Mandy, I do think that your quote on not living like you're on fire, otherwise you will burn out, that resonates with me and my organization completely. So I think a lot of us were taking some pretty furious notes during the presentation. I have a lot of notes to self and some to-dos for the rest of my day as a result. So unless we have any other questions, I just can't thank you enough. That was a wonderful presentation.
Well, I appreciate it very much. I want to make sure to, I was just going to say, make sure that the host gets switched back over. And I look forward to having more conversations with everyone that was on today. And I really appreciate the time that we spent together to just have us all start thinking about those conversations. I think you're going to get a link to a recording. So if you're note taking, couldn't keep up with how fast I was giving you all that information, you'll have that opportunity. But really, please just think about utilizing our services. You don't have to be in Sarasota. We do them virtually. We're also here. We man our phones during the work week with something we call Kind Line. All of our staff is trauma trained and compassion fatigue trained. And sometimes you just need someone to talk to and process with. And we're also here for that. So thanks so much for having me today.
Well, I'm incredibly proud to be a board member of Love for Lawrence and to have been behind the Resilient Retreat and the great work that you're doing. And thank you again to, we have this wonderful opportunity to present these lunch and learns as a result of ownership. Humana has made it a point to plant their flag on mental health and behavioral health causes, and has partnered with Love for Lawrence to present this content to you all. So thank you so much to Humana and the Community Foundation. And I'm really excited to present next month's Lunch and Learn series. It's going to be two of my very close friends, Chris Malaro and Nick Padlow, as a panel speakers, speaking on reducing the stigma in the military and civilian community. Nick and Chris are incredible entrepreneurs who both came from the Stanford and Wharton business schools and have since created venture-funded and private equity-funded organizations that are both in the mental and behavioral health space. So a very different spin on these topics, but also quite relevant. And their experience as veterans and entrepreneurs in this space, I think, will be fascinating. So excited to introduce them next month. And thank you all so much again for attending. And Mandy, have a great and wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you so much. I look forward to talking to you again.
Absolutely.
Thanks for your support of our work.
Absolutely. We'll see you later, everyone.